Functional threshold power. Does that term mean anything to you? I'm guessing for about 90% of the audience here, you actually have heard of functional threshold power. That is the term that basically means going along at your threshold on that very narrow edge between aerobic and anaerobic power, and that output that you can only just sustain for a defined length of time. And that length of time is somewhat arbitrarily chosen as 60 minutes. However, that 60-minute functional threshold test, the test for functional threshold power, is a pretty arduous test. It's a very arduous test for an amateur rider who perhaps isn't used to riding 60 minutes flat out. Riding 60 minutes flat out is no mean task. We're not talking here about just a social ride and gathering your data. I'm talking about time trial conditions where you're putting out your maximum effort for that whole 60-minute period, albeit one with correct pacing. So given that 60-minute test is so hard, we seem to have defaulted now back to a more convenience level of a 20-minute test. 20-minute test for critical power 20, CP20, then enables you to calculate what is the most probable result that you would get if you undertook that full 60-minute test. Now, back in 2001, Andrew Coggan published a suggestion in his report, Power-Based Training Levels, where he said that one way to deal with this problem of athletes not wanting to do the full 60-minute test is to backwards calculate what length of time trial you would need in order to be able to sustain between 3 and 5% of your maximum 60-minute output. In other words, backwards calculate what length of time trial would you need to do in order to not fall below, let's say, 5% of that predicted FTP 60 or CP 60. And he suggested back in 2001 that the approximate rate was for 20 minutes, so it was a 5% reduction in your 20-minute result of your FTP. So 0.95 times your 20-minute result gets you, apparently, your 60-minute final result. Great, convenient, everyone's happy, and that 95% simple multiplier has been propagated on endless websites, endless books since then, and it continues to go around like a bad penny, to be honest. Now, I've got here a more recent training Bible, if you like, Training and Racing with a Power Meter by Hunter Allen and co-written by Andrew Coggan. And let's have a quick look at what they say in this book under the section of FTP. So what they say here is that since 20 minutes is a shorter time period, it incorporates more of the athlete's anaerobic capacity. However, this skews the wattage data by about 5% over a 60-minute effort. By subtracting that 5%, you'll come up with a wattage number that will be very close to your 60-minute power measure. So there you have it, from the horse's mouth. That 5% reduction still is around in the Classic Training Bible of 2010-2011. My copy, by the way, kindly signed by Hunter Allen. And I've got nothing but respect for those authors, but frankly, regarding this 5% reduction, they are not correct. Now, it's one thing for me to stand here and say, I don't believe it's correct. It's quite another to shatter a cycling myth by providing you with the data. And if you look around the internet, you'll find very few contrary arguments to this 5% adjustment formula. In fact, I could only really find one contrary argument, and that's on the Flamme Rouge website. I'll publish the link below, out of St Helier in Jersey. So kudos to Flamme Rouge here. Anyway, without further ado, what am I saying then about this 5% adjustment and whether it applies or not? Well, just think, there are thousands of cyclists out there, and over the last 10 to 20 years, those cyclists have been putting their data on public forums, publishing them on blogs, uploading the data to Strava, sending them to cycle coaches. We've got this data behind the scenes, we've got a mass of data in fact, and using this mass of data, we can then analyze much more accurately what is the predicted drop-off from, let's say, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 20 to 60 minutes, or even further out, 4, 8, 24 hours. We can make much more accurate predictions now. And it turns out that if we analyze this massive data, that 5% figure is not just a simplification. It's not like 5% is the average here. No, the average drop, I'll tell you right now, the average drop from that CP20, critical power 20, and the CP60 for all cyclists is much more like 15%. It's much more like 15%. 5% is actually much more typical of a pro rider. 5 to 10% for a very good club, sports, regular rider who has tested regularly at hard rides above 60 minutes. But for those who are not used to doing that 60-minute threshold test, you cannot just do your 20-minute test and and take 5% off, because doing 3 times as much is much, much harder for that cyclist. It's very likely they won't even be able to do a full 60-minute FTP test and they'll actually fail at it. So therefore that subtraction is a nonsense. But if you do manage to get them to do it, it's much more likely that their power reduction will be much more severe than 5%. As I say, more like 10, 15, and sometimes higher than that. Now I can do even better for you. If you're prepared to tell me your age, your gender, and how regularly you're riding these kind of tests, and particularly in relation to this question, how regularly you're riding a hard ride of 60 minutes or more. And by that I mean a real sustained effort over that 60 minutes. So a 60-minute full-on race, or 60-minute time trial, or 60-minute turbo or Zwift session where you can gather that data. You see, the frequency by which you put yourself under those conditions actually will strongly determine how well you succeed at that FTP gold standard test. And that determines the rate of your fall from that 20 to 60 minutes. So to recap, if you're able to tell me your gender, your age, and how often you're testing over 60 minutes or more, I can give you what I think is a much more accurate prediction of your CP60 or your gold standard 60-minute FTP. And to put my money where my mouth is here, here's the link below to a new spreadsheet I'm uploading for you guys for free, which you can play around and tell me whether this prediction is more or less accurate than that 5% figure. I put it to you that 5% for all riders in all conditions, that can't be true. It's even if that was the mean, the typical, the average drop, 5% is not going to hold water for all riders. So here's a more sophisticated analysis based on our FastFitnessTips database of all the riders we've seen, plus those that are publishing their data on a public forum. This is the result I get. Okay, so let's have a look at the spreadsheet together quickly. Okay, so let's have a look at this FastFitnessTips calculator. This is the 20 to 60 minute FTP Predictor. So you'll notice here that there's various criteria that you're required to enter in order to generate a more accurate prediction. For example, enter your gender here, 1 for male, 2 for female. Enter your weight if you wish to do that. That's actually an optional field just in order to get the watts per kilogram calculated below. Enter your age. There's a slight age adjustment which is slightly different for males versus females. And then really the 2 key entry criteria are how often do you ride hard for 60 or more minutes. For example, this would include races of 60 or more minutes or full FTP testing for 60 or more minutes. Basically sessions where they're not just casual rides, but you're riding, for example, similar to time trial conditions, an all-out effort for 60 minutes or more. And you can enter rarely, sometimes, regularly, and there's 2 special field characters. You can enter 0 for this is my very first test of a 60-minute FTP, and you can also enter 4 for Neo-Pro, Pro or Ex-Pro rider. And then in E you enter the results of your most recent 20-minute power testing. Now I know you'll be asking how does this calculation work. So below then you'll see the Coggan predicted 95% figure, which is just 95% across the board. But you'll also see the FastFitnessTips predictor here, which hopefully is a little bit more accurate, depending on what you put in the fields above. Now, I know some of you will be asking, how does this calculation work? Well, essentially what it does is it takes your 20-minute power and gives you a ranking of that power. For example, are you at the 90th, 99th percentile? Are you on the 50th percentile, which is mid-table, or are you the 10th to 20th percentile? And then it forward projects that based on our database of riders of what those riders also did for 60 minutes, and it gives you a similar ranking. It forward projects that ranking up to 60 minutes, but then it gives us a correction based on how often are you completing those kind of rides, your age obviously, and gender as well. And there at the bottom that actually tells you what the drop is from your 20-minute estimate. So here, for example, the 33-year-old male entering 270 watts at 20 minutes has a 7.5% drop compared to 20%. Let's change that to 55-year-old female, let's say, riding, let's say, 225 watts. You can see there then the Coggan predicted formula would be 214, but we would project 209, which would actually be 7.3%. Change that to 22-year-old female with a high output, let's say 277. Then actually we would get a lower projection than 5% in this case for somebody riding regularly, 4.3%. But if we say is that a casual rider riding occasionally, you notice the drop is much more severe, about 11 or so percent. If we say rarely do I ride a hard 60-minute output, then the drop would be around 15%. So you can see the 20-minute power and the regularity of a 60-minute hard ride very much determines your power output over 60 minutes projected forward from 20 minutes. Let me know if you think there's any deviations from this, but in my opinion, this gives you a much more accurate method of predicting your FTP from that CP20, from the critical power 20 test. Let me know if you agree or disagree. If you've got data that's in the public domain that's more than just your personal ride that refutes this, I'd be interested to hear it. Because having looked at this in great detail, it turns out that Andrew Coggin himself is actually aware of this. And he published this statement on a website quite recently. Based on an N of 200 seasoned athletes, on average, the maximal power for 5, 20 and 60 minutes is 85, 73 and 63% of their 2-minute maximum. So if you put those numbers into a spreadsheet, what you'll find out is if you model it carefully, he's saying himself that regular seasoned athletes have a typical drop between CP20 and CP60 of 14%. But what I'm saying there is probably it's not just me who knows that 5% figure is not just an oversimplification. It's basically wrong for most riders. In fact, I estimate that less than 1 in 20 riders will have a 4, 5 or 6% drop from their CP20 to CP60. A much higher percentage have an 8 to 16% drop. And I think this is worth talking about because we don't need to be embarrassed if our FTP is much less than your CP20. We don't need to be embarrassed if our athletes that we coach come to us and say, look, I'm really struggling to hit that 5% drop. Actually, most people will struggle. So I'd rather we get this area right than keep propagating this myth. Okay, thanks for listening, guys. I think I've been on my high horse long enough about the inaccuracy of the 5% rule. So download the spreadsheet, have a play around with it, tell me what you think. Give me your comments below as always, guys. Take care, have a good ride.